All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second lecture for software process improvement this semester. And what I'd like to talk about to you this morning is about open source software development, partly because that's what the team projects in this course will be about. So I just want to make sure we all know a little bit of background about what open source software development is, how it works, where it comes from, and so on. The slides should already be online on my uni. If you can't access them, let me know. If you have any other sort of logistic question, let me know as well. I do have the chat window here, so if you type questions into the chat, I'll see them. I should be able to post assignment descriptions and so on before the end of the week. Okay, if there aren't any administrative questions or anything like that before we start, then let's get into the content. And I'd like to start by talking a little bit about what is open source software. And maybe first something we can clear up is a bit of terminology there. So sometimes open source software is called free software. Sometimes it's called free open source software. Sometimes it's called libre open software, which I guess is the Spanish or French word for free. So there are a few different terms that we usually encounter when we talk about open source software. I think by now open source software is probably the most commonly used of these terms, but some companies, some institutions sort of insist on calling it free or libre instead. And I think we can talk a little bit about the differences by just going through the questions on these slides. So one of the differences between open source and free is that open source necessarily means that a software project needs to come with a license that actually specifies who is allowed to use it, how you can reuse it, whether you're allowed to modify it, and so on. So for you to make an open source project available online, you need to include a license. If you just upload your source code somewhere, it might be free, but it's not open source. So open source necessarily includes a license. Just making source code available on the internet doesn't automatically make it open source. It might make it free because everybody can access it. Why do people create open source software? That's a question we'll talk about in a few minutes with some other slides a bit more as well. And the next question there as well, is it just for fanatics and hobbyists? I think that's kind of how it started, like 30, 40 years ago, probably. So back in the day, it used to be that there were the big corporations, like Microsoft had just started at around that time. IBM was still big in the software industry, that were selling software for money. And then there were some people with rather extreme views that software should never be sold for money and it should always be free. These are actually the people who kind of started the open source movement, who came up with the first licenses that would be used for open source projects, and that have been refined since then. That was sort of the start, that people really felt strongly that software should never be sold for money. As you can see from the reality in 2021, that didn't really pan out. A lot of software is still sold for a lot of money, but at the same time, there's a lot of open source software out there, and over time, we've come to appreciate some of the advantages of having software available as open source. One of the big advantages is that you can inspect the software. So, right, if you download something from a big corporation, let's use like Microsoft PowerPoint as an example, because that's the kind of slide that I'm looking at here at the moment. Right, if you download Microsoft PowerPoint, chances are you will not be able to see the source code of Microsoft PowerPoint. So you can never be 100% sure that it's bug-free, and chances are it's not bug-free because no software really is. So you can't be sure that it's bug-free, or even in more extreme cases, you can't be sure that they build in something to secretly turn on your camera and track you. I'm not saying Microsoft does this, of course, but because you can't inspect the source code, you can never be 100% sure what exactly is going on. Whereas with open source, you have the guarantee that the entire source code is open, it's free for inspection, so you can always go in and check exactly what is happening. And that's actually the reason why quite a few governments around the world, I know it's pretty big in Europe at the moment, that governments are increasingly using open source software rather than commercial software, because of course, as a government, they want to be able to say, no, we're not collecting data illegally. No, we're not doing bad things that the opposition might claim we're doing. Here, look at our source code. You can analyze it in detail and see that we're never storing this data and this data. We're not using your speeding tickets to increase your taxes or whatever it might be. So I think for institutions like governments that have a big interest in transparency, open source is a really good solution, because then they can always point people at the source code and say, oh, look at the source. This is obviously not what we're doing, what you're accusing us of. At the same time, especially with the rise of GitHub, which started 13 years ago, I guess now, 2008, and really sort of took over as the standard host for open source projects around like 8-9 years ago, around sort of 2012. With the rise of GitHub now, open source has actually sort of had some additional advantages as well, because some of you might have GitHub profiles. Actually, chances are the ones who went to practicals for this course, all will have a GitHub profile by now. And your own GitHub profile is a great way of showcasing your skills. And more companies have realized this as well, that I realize I'm teaching a university course here, but for a lot of people that the company might hire, they all have some university degree, so it kind of can make it difficult to compare different applicants. But if some of them have public GitHub profiles, and you can see the exact source code that they wrote, you can see how they interacted with other software developers as part of their open source contributions, that can be a plus. And it's a great way, just at a very basic level, to show off which programming skills you have, right? GitHub now displays everybody's programming languages in their profile, so you can just take a look at those and see what somebody might be good at or might not be good at, which you don't necessarily always get from a university transcript. And then indirectly through things like that, you can actually these days make money with open source software. And probably the biggest way of making money with open source software is actually to obviously not to sell the software, because the source code is public, so you can't do that. At least nobody would pay for it, but you can sell the consulting for it, right? If it's a fairly complex open source project that maybe is not trivial to understand, then sure, people can inspect the source code, but they might still not understand it, and they might still want your help to understand what's going on. Or they might pay you to build specific features, right? If there's a big open source project. So for example, Google is always a good example when it comes to open source projects, because Android started as open source, Chrome started as open source, and a lot of developers have been paid to contribute to those projects. Right, the last question I have on the slide there, does open source make for better software? My answer would be it depends. There's definitely some fanatics out there who swear by open source software, who would never download Microsoft Word but go for the LibreOffice alternative. I don't think it necessarily makes for better software, but it has these certain advantages of transparency in particular, and having sort of the whole development process transparent and open, that can be really useful in particular scenarios. Of course, there are other scenarios where a company or a developer might not be interested at all in sharing their source code, right? I know, for example, Adelaide is a big location for the Australian Defence. I'm not expecting them to greatly invest into open source projects, because they have no interest in, revealing to the entire world exactly what source code they might have and how it's written, and it might have bugs. So there are definitely scenarios where you might not be interested in using open source, but in just as many other cases you might be interested. And I thought we could just look at take a look at the official definition of open source. So this is from the Open Source Initiative. Just open this. I hope you can still see the browser screen. If not, message me on chat. Not seeing any chat messages. Good. Open source does not just mean access to the source code. Distribution terms of open source must comply to the following criteria. One big thing is free redistribution. So if you just want to publish your source code, but you don't want to allow other people to redistribute it further, then it's by definition not open source. So that could be a difference between uploading something to your own source, to your own website versus making it available under an open source license. It must include source code. I think that's a fairly straightforward point. So if you want to have open source software, there must be some software in there. The license must allow modification. So if you make the software available, the source code available as open source, you automatically allow others to make changes to it. It is something to sort of keep in mind, especially if you're running your own open source project. Somebody could just legally, perfectly fine with the license, somebody could just take your entire source code, add a new feature that somebody wanted, and all of a sudden become a lot more famous because of that project than you were to begin with. So if you make something available as open source, it sort of comes, it's owned by the entire open source community, and they might go and make it better, hopefully, and you may or may not be involved in this. Integrity of the author source code, that's sort of coming back to the licenses. And then the open source community has, a few regulations that I guess we should all have, no discriminations against persons or groups, against specific fields of endeavor. So there have been some discussions, should open source be used for genetic research, for nuclear research, for, maybe to operate cameras that might be used for surveillance and things like that. But yeah, the official definition of open source says that there should be no discrimination against any field of endeavor. Distribution of license. The license must not be specific to a product, so the license really applies to the source code, and if somebody just wants to reuse a small part of the source code and not the entire product, that's perfectly fine. With a license for an open source project, you can't restrict other software, and it must be technology neutral. So you can't say that, oh, I only ever want this app to run on, Android, and I will, be furious if somebody adopts it for iOS. That's not how open source works. Okay, let's go back to the slides then. So as you probably already gathered a little bit from what I talked about, open source has quite a few number of facets. Some people see it as a resource. That might actually be the scenario that most of you had in mind with open source so far, right? Sometimes when you don't want to pay for a software product, you might just be inclined to see if there's like some open source alternative that you can download for free. So it can't just be a resource. It can't just be a way of saying, well, I don't want to pay for software. Let's see if there's a good open source alternative out there that I can download and just get my stuff done. You're not actually interested in contributing back or anything like that. You just want free software, and that's perfectly fine. And for many commercial products, of course, there is a good open source alternative. Of course, one of the biggest, or maybe the biggest open source projects is Linux. So even for operating systems, we have a well-established open source alternative. Of course, Android's another example. Some people see it as an ethical choice. So some people strongly believe that companies should not be making money from software because, as you know, software is fairly, intangible. It's not like hardware where you can actually, touch the thing that you're selling. With software, it's just some bits and bytes, and some people strongly believe that companies should not be allowed to make money off something as trivial as bits and bytes. That's usually a fairly extreme view, and as I said at the beginning, that's probably the view that started the open source movement a few decades ago, but it's one that's probably become less and less important over time. Some see it as a as a technical choice. So these would be people who, for example, believe that it would be beneficial to their organization if they have all this transparency, if they can say, look, all our source code is available as open source. Some see it as the enemy. Again, this is going back in history a little bit. So in particular, Microsoft is a bit infamous for this. I think it was sort of around the early 1990s, that Microsoft really tried to push against open source because they were worried that they couldn't sell their own software products, and this was during the early stages of Windows. So they were really worried that they might not be able to make money off their operating system if there was an open source alternative available. That's become less and less of an issue, and actually all big software companies, Microsoft included, who have a lot of open source projects now, but they also don't make everything available as open source. So there's always a bit of a balance. And the pragmatic view, I guess, is that it's just another type of software, right? We're all using software to solve particular tasks we have. And for some things, you might like a particular commercial product. And for some things, there's just a better alternative that happens to be open source. Right. I think, for example, there are some strong feelings about whether you should be using an Android phone or an iOS phone. I'm pretty sure in not too many cases is the fact whether it's open source or not a big decider there. It's more about, which particular phone do you like the most and which platform can run your apps the best, rather than that one of them is open source and the other one is not. Okay. Why give away software? I think I covered some of this already, so I'll go over this a bit faster now. People have different reasons why they want to make their software available for free. It can be an ethical choice. It can be to participate in the community and gain recognition. So as we'll find through this course, and as you might already know, the open source ecosystem in particular, the way that GitHub has sort of pushed it forward, it kind of works almost similar to Stack Overflow, right? On Stack Overflow, of course, nobody gets, or very few people get paid to ask questions and to answer questions. But you get recognition, right? You get all these points, you get the stars and the badges and the bounties and whatnot, that obviously motivate a lot of people to give away their free time in many cases and contribute to a site like Stack Overflow. GitHub sort of works in similar ways, right? If you're running a lot of famous GitHub projects and you have provided a lot of patches that have fixed really serious bugs in existing software, you gain recognition. And because GitHub has sort of this profile-centric view of the world, all your contributions can be easily accessed, especially the public ones, just by looking at your GitHub profile. Reduce future maintenance burden. Actually, that's a good point that at least for myself, I've used in the past as a motivation to make something, or justification to make something available as open source. So if you have developed something, for example, for a university project that is a nice prototype, but you can't be bothered to maintain it for many years in the future, one way to at least have some hope that it will, not die, that it will be maintained, is to make it available as open source, advertise it a little bit, and hope that somebody else picks it up and says, well, this is a really cool project. I'll be the one to make sure that it also runs on future versions of the operating system. As you probably all know, as you've heard in other courses, right, the software development, the cost of initially developing it is usually smaller than the cost of maintaining it in the future, right? The cost of making sure that it will run on all the future versions of the operating systems, that it will run once all the libraries have been patched and so on. So if you don't want to deal with this maintenance burden, but you think you have a really nice prototype, what you could do is make your prototype available as open source, try to advertise it a little bit, social media, and hope that somebody else picks it up and turns it into something even better. Also, if you have developed some software, but you can't really be bothered to, maybe have your own startup or try to sell it to a company, but you still want want to enable people to use it, then open source can be a way to just get users without having to deal with all the financial aspects, which also means you're not going to be making any money, but setting up your own company just to sell a small software prototype isn't always worth it. Of course, it is in some cases. What do you contribute to open source? Well, in this particular course, you're hopefully going to pass the course. So that's one that's probably not on the slide there. People in the open source community tend to be very grateful. So you might get thanks from users, just like you might get a thank you note from somebody on Stack Overflow, a thank you comment. Realistically, that's probably not going to be the main motivation of too many people. Recognition of your coding skills. I think that's one that's becoming more and more important, because I'm aware of many companies who will at least optionally ask applicants for software-related jobs for their GitHub profiles. So if you don't have a GitHub profile, that might already tell them something. Well, maybe it just tells them you don't want to share your GitHub profile. But if you have a really good profile that shows that you contributed to projects and all these different technologies, which gives them some assurance that in addition to the university's transcript, you actually have skills in those particular technologies, that can be a really useful way of basically taking advantage of what you have done in the open source world. Yeah, that's related to the second to last point there as well, job offers. Help develops your software from other programmers, sure. And use a large body of source code, much of it high quality, right? So if you want to reuse software, in particular, if you want to make modifications to the source code, you kind of have to go for open source, because a lot of commercial source code is, of course, not available for free. Cool. How big is open source? Well, on GitHub, we have millions of projects, definitely hundreds of thousands, probably millions. On SourceForge.net, there are a number of projects registered. The slide says 400,000. This might actually be a bit outdated by now, in particular because GitHub has overtaken SourceForge a while ago as sort of the main site for open source projects. Of course, it's still not the only one. So I keep referring to GitHub here. There's also Bitbucket, there's GitLab, and a couple of others. So it's definitely not the only one. It just happens to be the one that has clearly the most number of projects, most number of developers, and so on. So yeah, the open source movement is big. Chances are you already knew that. How many users? Well, certainly many millions. If you're on an Android phone, then you're automatically an open source user, and chances are, even if you're not on an Android phone, you're running something that's open source somewhere. What types of products can be open source? Well, really everything. It started mostly in the operating systems field, because Linux was one of the first and groundbreaking open source projects at the time. A lot of servers still run those versions of Linux, but by now, anything from mobile app to anything in the embedded market is available as open source, as we already talked about, right? Even alternatives to products like Microsoft Office are available as open source. Right, open source community, and that's something we will talk a little bit throughout this course, because as you know, as part of the team projects, I will be asking you to make contributions to an existing open source project. And something to keep in mind is that each open source project sort of has a bit of its own culture. There's definitely commonalities among different subcultures for different projects, but different projects handle sort of everything related to their project, I guess, differently. In the case of your group assignments, this will be mostly related to the particular contribution processes. So, to use a fairly extreme example, some projects mandate code review for every line of code that comes in, and other projects do not. So that's sort of a big difference. Some projects will want every new contribution to be related to an existing issue or bug report. So they wouldn't accept anything that's not linked to something that they already had in their plan. Other projects don't care about that. Some projects are extremely well documented and wouldn't accept a new contribution without corresponding documentation. Others don't care as much. Actually, a really good example is that some projects require that every new contribution comes with its own test cases. Obviously, it depends on the testing framework, programming language, and so on. But there are definitely projects that will reject any pull request that comes without new test cases, whereas others, don't care. I mean, sure, we all like testing, but they might accept some new feature contribution even if it hasn't been thoroughly tested and as accompanied by test cases. Something that is fairly common across all projects is that it tends to be quite a meritocracy, I guess, right? So there's usually a few strong people who started the project, but even that can change, right? People leave projects, people come back to projects, and so on. There's the right to fork, which means there's the right to just say, okay, I don't like where this project is going. I've contributed to it a little bit now, but I'm just going to create my own copy. And this copy is going to be so much better than the original project. Developers generally are a bit reluctant to do that because if it happens too much, then we just have, a billion different versions of like LibreOffice or whatever it might be out there. You actually do see this with Linux. Everybody who has used Linux before will be aware that there are many, many different versions. There's Linux, there's Unix, there's BSD, and all of these come with different versions. So that's basically exactly what has happened there, right? A few developers didn't really like where the main project was going, so they created a copy of the main project and then created their own version of it. If that happens too often, then the market becomes so scattered that if you're trying to download Linux, you don't even know where to start because you have a million alternatives that you could download. So in general, people are reluctant to do that. Having said that, if the project has been around for a really long time, it kind of happens naturally. The open source community generally has a quite technical focus. So it's focused on source code, right? It was started by developers. It's focused on source code. You will probably not receive the most positive feedback if you're trying to use an open source project for something that's not, technical. It's possible, it has been done, but I remember a few years ago we were analyzing some existing projects on GitHub, and one of the ones that we needed to exclude was a political campaign. It wasn't even a site; it was sort of they used the repository, the GitHub repository, to organize the political campaign for Bernie Sanders in the US election at the time. So there are definitely some open source projects out there that have nothing to do with source code, but they tend to be a tiny minority. Openness and communication, and that's something that we'll also be looking at for your team projects, actually. So the idea of many open source projects is that all communication should be, definitely open, just as the source code, but that it should also be archived. So open source developers typically do not appreciate, having conversations that you can never go back to because they happened in person and were never written down. So the open source community definitely likes channels such as Slack or Discord or something like that, or just lots of communication inside of GitHub issues, inside of GitHub pull requests, where you discuss, should you develop the feature this way, should you develop the feature this other way, and that then automatically means that these decisions are documented. Something which, in commercial software might not happen all the time. Especially with if companies, if they have developers co-located. Of course, that happens a bit less frequently now with the pandemic. But yeah, if companies have developers co-located, then it can happen that you just talk to your colleague and the conversation never gets recorded. The open source community does not like that. They want to be able to go back to previous communication. Right, open source culture, I guess I talked about this a little bit already. So originally it came from a hacker culture, from people with fairly extreme views about that all software should be free. At least historically, there has been a bit of hostility against proprietary software. I think that's something that has really diminished over the last 10 years, probably, especially with big companies, big software companies, Microsoft, Google, IBM, and so on, investing a lot into open source and having their own and running their own very popular open source projects. Facebook's actually another one of those that runs some really good open source projects. The open source culture also has a strong emphasis on giving credit where credit is due. So just because of the way that the contributions are done, especially now with GitHub, it's always possible to link every contribution, every line of source code really to the particular person who has made that contribution. But most open source projects go even a bit further, and at the bottom of their README file, they will have a list of the names of people who have made useful contributions to the project. They might even, I remember I fixed, I think it was a documentation bug a while ago in some open source project, and then I was mentioned in some monthly newsletter of all the people who had contributed. Just saying that to emphasize that open source projects, many open source projects tend to push quite far with giving credit to people who have made contributions. So it's really a culture of acknowledging sort of every line of code that somebody has contributed. Self-deprecation, modesty encouraged. The documentation is usually quite honest. Projects get stuck at version 0.9, which happens less frequently when you're trying to sell your software for money. So if you're trying to sell your software for money, even the first prototype is probably called version 1.0 to tell everybody that this is the finished product and they should give you lots of money. Open source projects sort of go the other way, and even if the project is already used by millions of people, it might still be the pre-release version, and we can't guarantee that it actually works. As you may have seen, if you have used open source projects, and I think many of you have, is that open source tends to value technical stuff, technical reality, it says on the slide, over image and appearance. I think anecdotally that's definitely true. So if you look at things like user interface design, I hope I'm not upsetting anybody if I say that Windows looks nicer than Linux does. Same thing for Microsoft Word, PowerPoint compared to their LibreOffice versions. That's not necessarily saying that it works any better, but I think if you're trying to sell your software for money, so if you're in the commercial space, chances are you put more effort into making sure that it looks really nice, even if it might not work any better. Whereas the open source community doesn't really appreciate that, right? They focus more on getting the features right, getting them to work, and as long as there's a button somewhere, then they care less about what exactly that button looks like. Forking. So forking is just a technical term for making a copy of an existing open source repository and sort of putting it under your own account. So in GitHub, that's very easy. Every repository has a little fork button at the top if you look at the GitHub website, so you can create your own copy of every project that's on GitHub, and other hosting sites have very similar functionality. So yeah, the open source community really believes in this, right? That everybody should be allowed to create their own copy of the project and make the changes that they really believe in. I guess we talked about this a little bit already, right? The right to fork, but also the reluctance to fork. People also realize that if you create too many copies of the project, then it becomes hard to find the main one, and the fork is usually an indication that somebody is unhappy with where the project was going. to forks, you can always create a branch. So that's basically creating a branch in somebody else's repository where the intention is clearly to go back to the main branch. That is something that, especially with GitHub pull requests, has sort of become built into the GitHub way of doing things. At the latest, if you're not familiar with how GitHub does this yet, at the latest, we'll go through this in the Prax in week 2 or 3, fairly soon. So the GitHub way of doing this is that you make your own changes in your own branch, but then you try to merge that branch back into the main branch, usually using a pull request. Right. We talked about this, so strong emphasis on credit. Giving credit where credit is due, often in the copyrights headers, sometimes in a separate credits file, often in some website, in commit messages, and so on. Okay, so for the last, how many minutes do we have left? Maybe about 10. I want to talk a little bit about how to make contributions to open source. I'll talk about a few specific things that aren't necessarily related to what we'll be doing in the team project, because what I'm going to ask you in the team project is something fairly specific, whereas all the different ways that somebody can contribute to open source are actually a bit broader than that. So contributing to open source can be rewarding, can be a way to learn, can be a way to teach, can be a way to build experience in just about any skill you can imagine. Why do people contribute to open source? There's definitely a lot of different reasons there. So one way is to learn a new skill or to improve existing skills, right? If you're kind of unsure about how good your JavaScript skills are at the moment, one way to get them up to speed could be to sit down for a week or so and try to make a contribution to an existing JavaScript project. Chances are you'll learn something along the way, and in addition to that, it will be linked to your GitHub project, to your GitHub profile, and you can show that off to other people, such as employers, afterwards. Obviously, if you have a community of people who are all volunteering their time to contribute to a certain project, chances are, they are people who are interested in similar things. So open source is definitely also a way to just meet people with similar technical interests as you. Big open source projects, at least before the pandemic, used to have in-person meetups at a fairly regular rate as well. Some of the bigger open source projects, they even have their own conferences. So, everybody who's interested in that project can get together once a year. Again, this is something that we hope will come back once the pandemic is over. I'm assuming at the moment a lot of these things are happening via Zoom as well. Contributing to open source is also a great way to just, especially if it's a friendly open source project, and the majority of them are, to find somebody who can teach you things, or once you know them, then you can teach others. Especially because of how the code review process works, right? If you, let's say you want to learn JavaScript, right? You're making your first contribution to an existing JavaScript project, but you haven't really figured out all the corner cases of JavaScript yet. So you submit your contribution, but you get lots of code review back, right? You get lots of feedback on your contribution, and chances are once you address all that feedback, you've actually become a better developer as part of it, and you have hopefully made a useful contribution to an open source project. So it can really be a way of mentoring and teaching. Build public artifacts that help you grow your reputation. We talked about that. And learn people skills, right? Most open source projects, and definitely the ones that will try to contribute to as part of this course, are relatively large in terms of number of people. We have at least have dozens, sometimes hundreds of people involved, and once you have a software project where hundreds of people are involved, you need to coordinate with others in order to make sure that your contribution goes to the right place, that you have thought of all the constraints that you need to think about. and you might have, merge conflicts that you need to resolve and so on. And that's something that you can sort of practice as part of making contributions to big open source projects as well. Of course, this doesn't happen if you contribute to a small open source project where it might just be yourself and maybe one other person. Why contribute to open source? I think another way, and I guess that's partly how open source started as well, is that if you're using an existing open source project, let's say you're using LibreOffice, the open office alternatives to all the Microsoft products, and you don't like a particular feature, right? Or you're missing a particular feature. You're thinking, well, this is great, but the spell checker consistently gets this one word wrong, or I don't like the color of that button. Well, with open source, you can actually go in and make that change. And you can make that change in your own copy and then keep using your own copy. Or if you think your change is good enough that maybe the entire community would benefit from it, you can try to push that change back to the main repository. And maybe all of a sudden, all users have the new button with the new color that you preferred. So it can be a way to make changes that will be used by millions of users if you pick the right open source. So that can be a cool experience as well. What it means to contribute, so that's going to be the last piece of part of slides that we'll go through for today. Initially, the process can be quite intimidating, and that's partly why I think it's a good idea to do this as part of a university course, because we can sort of, walk you through the different steps and have a few milestones along the way to make sure that everything is going the right way. Also, one part why it can be intimidating to contribute to open source is just because there are millions of open source projects. How do you pick the one that you want to contribute, right? It's always a bad experience if you contribute to a project and then you never get any feedback on your contribution, maybe because the person who runs the project is no longer interested in the project, or maybe they just generally don't accept contributions from people they don't know in person, or any version of that, right? And then some other projects are just too large to understand. I mean, sure, it'd be really cool to make a contribution to Linux and change one of the biggest operating systems in the world, but it also means that you need to understand at least a good chunk of how Linux works, and that's not a small feat. So partly why we're doing this as part of a course is that I can steer you towards some open source projects where we know that student contributions will be well received. You can contribute in general to open source in other ways than code. Of course, for the team project in this course, I will expect you to contribute code. But just to talk about a few other things, there's lots of other contributions that you can make. Right, so you could get involved in a community organization. I don't think I'll talk about that too much. But there's other things such as design, for example, right? If you might not be the best programmer, but you think that the visual design of a particular open source project isn't right. Maybe they have colors that don't match well or something like that. Sorry, I'm not an artsy person. I don't know exactly what could be wrong, but that's something you could contribute that likely will need very little programming skills, if any. If you don't want to write source code, but you want to write documentation, maybe because you're a user of the project and you know exactly, how to use it, you could always write documentation rather than source code. So that could be another way. And actually, some of the contributions that we see from people who contribute to a project for the first time is actually translations. So a lot of open source projects, would like to have their product translated into, many other languages, but of course the maintainer doesn't speak that many languages. So they make their all their strings, basically all the strings that they have in their project, available, and then you can contribute a new file and say, okay, I just translated all the strings in the project to French or something. So that can be a nice way of contributing to open source as well without ever having to touch source code. Right. If you like organizing, you can try to help an existing open source project just get their issues organized. Maybe some of them have already been addressed but are still open. Maybe some are duplicate ones, and so on. And of course, if you like to code, and then there's always a lot to do, and that's what we'll focus on in this course. Finding an open issue of an existing open source project and trying to tackle that, writing a new feature, fixing an existing bug, maybe even automating some setup. That's actually something we'll cover in, I think, the last prac, so the one in week 5. Or improve the testing. Actually, that's another way that you can help an existing open source project. If you see that parts of their code have not been tested, chances are they'd be very happy if somebody went and wrote test cases for them. Maybe they've just been too busy to do that themselves. So in summary, there are many different ways of contributing. Answering questions can be another one, for example, on Stack Overflow. Code review can be another one. So there are millions of open pull requests at any given time on GitHub, where somebody's hoping that somebody will review their code. Because everything's open, there's nothing stopping you, even if you don't know the project in detail, to go in and say, actually, I think there's a little bug in the code here, and this should go inside the for loop instead of outside. So lots of ways of contributing. And I think that'll be the last slide for this morning then. Open source generally refers to software. Most open source projects are software projects, but because GitHub by now has millions of projects and repositories, you'll also find a lot of other things on there, from books to recipes to a lot of teaching content, actually. So there are quite a few tutorials on GitHub now. And same thing, because they are open source, you can go and improve them, right? If you think a particular part of a tutorial doesn't work, you actually need to do another step before this step, that's something you can go and fix. Okay, I don't think we'll get to the source code management today then. We have about 3 minutes left. I haven't gotten any questions via chat from anybody, so this could be a moment to ask something on chat. Just leave it open for a little bit. Don't see anything at the moment. Okay, so as you probably know, next Monday is a public holiday, so there's no lecture on Monday. The next lecture is going to be same time as today, a week from now. There's still, so I know one prac has definitely happened, maybe 2. I think there's a few more today and tomorrow, and one on Friday as well. So go to the pracs. That's where we'll make sure that everybody sort of at the same level when it comes to playing with all the advanced features of GitHub, so that at least you're comfortable with the tooling itself before we start looking into specific open source projects that we can contribute to. And I'll try to post more stuff about the assignments and due dates and things like that before the end of the week, or at least before we meet again. And then if I don't see any additional questions, the lecture slides are already online. The lecture recording will be online later today. If you have any questions, feel free to email or post on the MyUni forum. And then thanks everybody for listening, and I'll see you again in a week. All right, have a good day. Bye.